Rosie is also into research, and what we're going to hear about as part of the session is the research that she undertook on behalf of EDT into the use and value of labour market information. In terms of how we thought we could structure the time that we've got, which is between 5 and 6:30, we first of all got a poll to engage you in sharing what your sense and use of labour market information is in your work. And then we're going to hand over to Rosie, who's got a PowerPoint presentation that she'll share with us. And she'll certainly be prepared to take some questions at the end of that presentation before opening us up into some breakout rooms to pick up some of the themes for discussion. And then at about 6:10, we'll come back, hopefully with some interesting insights from each of the breakout rooms, and Wendy will corral us into a good discussion of those themes and areas for exploration between 6:10 and 6:30, when we're due to finish the seminar. As people will have seen, the seminars being recorded, which will be useful for sharing with other participants. So a big welcome to everybody, and a big welcome particularly to Wendy and to Rosie, who are going to lead us through the seminar. In terms of the poll, I'll ask Michael to launch that, and that's really just as a starting point in terms of your perception of how central labour market information is to your work. And we'd also ask that you put into the chat what your main sources of labour market information are, in terms of what you use in your work, which might be as a teacher or as a guidance practitioner, or in the sorts of role that you carry through. So there's 2 tasks we'd like you to do to respond to the poll, which Michael will launch, and to put into the chat your main sources of labour market information that you use. So thanks for that, Michael. Any other sources people want to add? Otherwise, maybe it's worth moving on to the presentation, Rosie, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, people can continue to post their thoughts in the chat box as we go through. This is the session, thinking about labour market information and guidance. I'm going to draw particularly in this session from this report, which was published in 2019 by the Education Development Trust. It was written by me and some colleagues. It's a literature review covering 10 years of literature up to 2018, and it's incorporated academic and grey literature. And it was global in focus, but as is the nature of a lot of literature in our field, a lot of the literature came from the global north. So to start the session, I thought what would be useful would be to introduce labour market information. The first thing to say is that when you look at the literature, so undertaking this literature review, this is a quotation that appears very frequently, or it's referenced very frequently. So this is from Marcus Offer from 2001 and the book Career Guidance in Context. And he says, what makes career guidance distinctive is the application of and reference to expert knowledge and understanding of the labour market and its functioning. So a really clear statement that actually labour market information is what makes our profession distinctive from other forms of helping. But having established that, I also wanted to start with a bit of a confession. I was really pleased to be asked to undertake this literature review. And when I was asked to look at it, it took me back to being a trainee. It made me remember what it was like training as a career guidance practitioner in the early 2000s. And I picked up at that point that labour market information, as Marcus Offer says, is vitally important. It's central to my work as a career guidance practitioner. And I went to LMI sessions and I read LMI bulletins, and almost all of the information that I accessed, which was under the term labour market information, or LMI, was mostly statistical in nature, and there was a lot of forecasting of skills needs, and it was mostly from a national context, although some was regional. And for me at that point, as a trainee, I felt significant doubt. I thought, what am I supposed to do with this information? How do I use this information with my clients, who are mostly in a very rural, small community? They might be, a lot of them were adults at that point thinking about career changing. How does thinking about whether there'll be a future shortage of plumbers or engineers, how can I use that in my practice? And so actually this literature review was a fantastic opportunity to explore contemporary thinking around labour market information. And for me, it kind of helped answer some of these questions that I had at an earlier point in my life. And I hope that some of the report helps current trainee practitioners or other people who are thinking about actually what is labour market information and how is it useful and how can we use it. So these are some of the questions really that have informed the literature review, like I say, and have informed this presentation. So the first part of this presentation, then, I want to think about definitions of labour market information, and then we'll think a little bit about how we can use labour market information in practice. So these are the two key themes in this report. The first thing to say about labour market information is when we came to searching the literature, an awful lot of literature is written about labour market information, which is not primarily about career guidance. It's about economic policy or educational policy. It's about national economic development often. So there's a lot of work that's been done that looks at the importance of national labour market information systems to support economic growth, and particularly from a kind of developing world context, the importance of having labour market information systems to be able to support the economic growth in your country. And in these documents, LMI typically focuses on the analysis of supply and demand of labour. It's often statistical, it's often from very large data sets, and it's often national in nature. And there's quite a lot written about the nature of this data, and from a kind of national labour market information systems perspective, there's consideration particularly of developing this data set in international contexts, and how there are some limitations in that data set, particularly around the ability to capture informal work and the ability to forecast, future forecasting, because what our labour market looks like right now might not be what it looks like in the future, and it's quite difficult to predict future shocks, things like the COVID pandemic, those kinds of things. So thinking about labour market information from that kind of perspective, and not necessarily from a guidance perspective, but from an economic policy perspective, often labour market information is understood as essential to understand how your economy is functioning, to understand how the labour market is functioning. The assumption there is of a market model, so of people supplying labour and employers buying labour, and there are just debates or discussions about how you use that labour market information to then improve functioning of the labour market. So from that context, there's discussion about how some time ago, maybe this kind of data was used to develop interventionist approaches. For example, the development of detailed manpower plans. So countries can intervene to improve the functioning of their labour market. But contemporary moves are towards facilitative approaches, and these kind of approaches emphasise sharing of information to users within the marketplace, with the idea that if users are more informed, then the labour market will function more effectively. So employers need to be informed about who's available in the workforce. Employees or potential employees need to be informed about what's available in the labour market. And I wanted to give this context just because I think it was quite helpful to me in understanding some of the policy threads that come into our work as career guidance practitioners or researchers or educationalists. So information is understood as being useful to individuals as a way of improving their ability to function within the labour market and therefore to improve the labour market. However, when you look at the other literature, so literature around what people making career decisions or making labour market decisions find useful, the nature of the information is often different to the nature of the information which is the focus of sort of economic policy interests. So the evidence suggests that for individuals, statistical information is often difficult to interpret. So understanding what statistics mean for you as an individual is quite hard. And there's evidence that inspiration is often valued rather than information. So inspiration being a kind of information, I guess, which helps you to visualize what you could do or is personal. You can see how it would make a difference to you. You can see yourself in that kind of role. Whereas information which is dry or statistical in nature is much harder to interpret in that way. Research also suggests that users need specific kinds of information, for example, progression routes. It's not just about what jobs are available, it's about how I can progress in my life through the labour market. Individuals need local labour market information, so not necessarily national labour market information, but actually what's available here in my community. They need information about future trends, because for some young people, they'll be entering the labour market. You know, if you're working with somebody at school, it might be 10 years down the line that they're going to enter employment. Transferability, so moving from one job to another. I have this kind of skills, I have these kinds of qualifications, what else can I do? Recruitment and selection methods, so how to access the labour market. So these are kinds of specific sorts of information that people making career decisions need, but might not always be considered when you think about labour market information from a sort of workforce planning approach, I guess. So in the careers literature, typically labour market information, a kind of narrow definition of labour market information which focuses on statistical information about the workforce sectors, is expanded into a much wider definition. So you've got definitions of hard and soft LMI, so kind of statistical information alongside more qualitative information, or LMI and labour market intelligence. So labour market intelligence being information which is interpreted for people. And then you've got even wider definitions like all qualitative and quantitative information that's relevant, and all types of information used in decisions. And then you've got definitions that blend career information and labour market information into a kind of term of careers and labour market information. So here you can really see a kind of blurry line between sort of the narrow definitions that might be more common within policy interests or economic policy interests and into much wider forms of information. So one of the things that we say in this report is that there are potentially some definitional risks when we talk about labour market information. The question is, are we always talking about the same thing? Because the kinds of information that a decision maker, a career decision maker needs might be different from the kind of information that somebody who is planning, somebody who works for a college planning courses might need, or the information that an employer might need, or the information that somebody who's involved in developing national policy might need. And because labour market information is a term that's widely used in sort of economic development type policy, we have suggested here that using the terminology of LMI locates the work of us as careers advisors and services in terms of national economic and educational policy interests. And there's a risk there that when we are talking about LMI, especially to people who don't come from a careers background, that it might underplay or emphasize other kind of forms of information which other people might not include in their definitions of LMI. So things like occupational information and educational information and qualitative information. So insights rather than statistics necessarily. So that was one of the things that I think is quite interesting and might be an interesting point for discussion in this group. So one of the interesting things, again, that comes out of the literature when we're looking at the literature is that despite a lot of information being available, potentially because we're not always thinking about the needs of career decision makers in national labour market information systems, there are some gaps in the information that we have and that would be useful for decision makers. So the kinds of gaps that are identified in the literature are these. So local labour market information is often difficult to source. Information on educational and vacancy data, so particularly information which combines, which presents blended information, so information alongside about occupational routes and careers information, which also incorporates information about where you can undertake courses, for example, or currently available vacancies. And data on transferability of skills. So we have data about different kinds of jobs and different kinds of roles. We use SOC codes for different occupations, but actually what data do we have, or do we have enough data about how people can move between different roles in terms of transferability of skills? So those are three kinds of gaps, and more generally there are issues with fragmented provision and a lack of integrated information, an over-reliance on statistical data, and a need for more transformational translation into learning materials. So we have quite a lot of data that's available, but there are some gaps maybe in some forms of data, and then also how that data is presented. Again, the literature talks about ways of addressing those gaps and improving information, and there's been a lot of work in this area. So although those gaps are ones that appear in the literature, there are examples of innovations that are attempting to address those gaps. Key ways of addressing those gaps are around collaboration and coordination at both national and local levels. So, for example, particularly local labour market information, bringing key players together at a local level and sharing information, potentially not necessarily even in writing, but you know, sharing information amongst key people within local areas can be a really important source of labour market information. And collaboration at sort of national levels as well. So we've got a lot of different interests, a lot of different players really in the labour market, and so coordinating the information that like colleges and education providers have alongside organisations who advertise employment, advertise jobs, alongside the occupational and careers information that we have. So kind of coordinating those kinds of information is valuable. And there's also a lot of work that's been done to think about capitalising on the value of the internet. And there's some really interesting examples of work in this area. So the internet is really fascinating because potentially we can present a lot of information, we can blend a lot of sources of information through internet delivery, but also people who access the internet are creating content, and we're creating a huge amount of labour market information just through individual interactions. So individuals post on social media about their jobs, and we've got LinkedIn, we've got lots and lots of information, we've got employers with their websites and their annual reports, we've got official sources and providers uploading reports and data and things. So there's lots and lots of sources of information. And it's interesting that in the chat box, when I looked just before we started this presentation, most people were saying that their sources of information were websites. and mostly official sources, and mostly official websites, I would say. But some of this work is thinking about, can we capitalize on the information that individuals are putting into the internet? So, for example, organizations who are advertising jobs have a lot of information about how people are applying to those jobs. They have potentially quite large banks of CVs if they're requesting that end users upload CVs. And then we've got a big bank of data that could be used to explore how people are operating within the labour market. And you've got things like Glassdoor, effectively an employee review site, so where employees can review their employers and provide information about application processes and those kinds of things. So some really interesting potential developments in labour market information that can come from the use of the internet. So that's thinking about labour market information and what it is and how it can be developed potentially. The next part of this presentation, I wanted to think about uses of labour market information and what the evidence suggests, how the evidence suggests we can use labour market information in career guidance or career provision more widely. The first thing to say is that there is very limited evidence in the literature of the impact of information, very limited. And the main issue here is that trying to isolate the impact of information on career decision making apart from other forms of intervention is really hard, because information is typically delivered through guidance or through a group session or some form of intervention. So isolating the impact of just the information component of those interventions is really hard. So there's very little information or very little evidence about the impact of information itself. But there is quite a lot of discussion about how information on its own would be insufficient or could even be counterproductive in some cases. So the first point here is from Grubb's 2002 paper. It's slightly outside of the 10-year frame of this report, but it's quite an important paper because it offers a very robust critique of the value of information. And Grubb is basically saying that career decisions require more than simply a measuring or a measuring up of the pros and cons of different options in a kind of complete way. He says that it would be impossible to have all the information and to kind of calculate all the possible implications of that information over a life course. So information on its own is not sufficient, and rational decisions are, the idea that career decisions are rational is problematic. But there's other information here, other evidence here from other researchers that has also pointed to information on its own potentially being counterproductive, even because individuals can feel information overload, and that can actually impede decision making. There's too much information to take on board, so I just won't think about it. However, the literature does show some evidence to suggest that information is valuable in specific ways and at specific points for individuals who are making decisions. So the first point here is that there's some evidence that information which is provided in a targeted and timely manner and in the context of bounded decisions can be helpful. So McNally's paper here is interesting because it reports on an intervention whereby young people who are at the age of applying for university were provided with information about applications for university at particular points. And that information was helpful to them in supporting their decisions to apply and where to apply. Interestingly, it wasn't helpful to everybody because, and what they say in this paper is that individuals had to be planning to go to university in the first place. It didn't necessarily change people's ideas who weren't planning to go to university. There's other evidence that mediated information, so where information is mediated by career professionals, it can be helpful because career professionals can provide personalised recommendations, and that can increase motivation and help filter out noise. So these references here are to include reference to some work in Canada where individuals were given resources, like resources to work through, and the impact on individuals was greater where they were supported in accessing those resources by a career practitioner. And finally here, there's another point where the evidence is that information which is provided with a pedagogical design and purpose is more effective. So where there's a kind of learning outcome, where it's clearly structured, it can be helpful to individuals. So there's evidence that information is valuable and often in particular ways, but information on its own or information as sufficient for career decision making is problematic idea. So I was just going to, again, this might be something that's interesting to reflect on in this group. One of the things that we say in this report is that it might be an interesting question about whether we think about information as a product. Is it information that we are giving as career professionals, I guess? Or are we supporting people to become informed? Is it a process? And this was quite an interesting sort of point for reflection for me, I think, because thinking about how we engage with people in order to help them become informed perhaps is a little bit more accurate in terms of the way that information can be used most effectively, I think. So the last kind of few slides really are just thinking about labour market information in terms of career guidance, or one-to-one provision primarily. So the last few slides I've thought about what the research says about careers provision generally. These next slides I want to think about career guidance specifically, just because that is quite a key part of this report. So there is some discussion in the literature about how the use of information, or information is positioned differently by different models of guidance. So different ideas about what we're doing in career guidance position information differently. So trait and factor models would tend to position information as something that we give to our clients. We are expert practitioners, we can match people to opportunities in the workplace, and we would provide information. Humanistic approaches would tend to focus on career practitioners supporting individuals to access their own information. What information do you need? Where can you get it from? That kind of approach. And then social learning approaches would focus on information provision in terms of learning. So providing information as a way of supporting learning or helping people through learning. There's also a sort of emerging body of literature, I would say, around using information for more critically and for engaging critically with the workplace. So this ties in with some of the contemporary work around career guidance and social justice. So labour market information can help us understand as career professionals what's going on in the workplace, and that can help us to critique it and sometimes perhaps to even challenge what's happening in the workplace. So for example, increases in temporary employment and employment terms and conditions, those kinds of things. There's also some work that's looked at decision-making styles and about how different individuals with different decision-making styles may place a different value on information and access different kinds of information as well, or value different kinds of information. So I think what we wanted to do in this part of the report is really highlight that information is something, thinking about theoretical approaches or models of guidance is important when we think about information, because how we think about our practice influences then how we might use information, and that there are different ways of thinking about how information might be used. Recognizing that a lot of contemporary practice is influenced by humanistic models and kind of coaching approaches. One of the things we also did in this report was to pull out some of the contemporary sort of advice or principles or tips for career practitioners working with labour market information. And these were some of the key points. So one of the points was that information should be used with care. It's not something, we shouldn't just go around kind of throwing information out there. We need to use it with care. When we use information, we need to make sure it's purposeful. What is the purpose of sharing this with my client? It's clear and it's understandable. It also needs to be provided sensitively, because it can be challenging to an individual. In fact, often providing information is a form of challenge. So you're presenting some information which might challenge the client's understanding of the labour market and what they think is possible, or how they think things might be possible. This next point I think is interesting. So information might be used indirectly to support the process of guidance rather than directly. So to an extent, this answers some of my questions when I was a trainee practitioner back in 2000 and something. And I was feeling like I should be using information more in my practice, but I wasn't sure how. Well, actually, some writers would suggest that we are using information even when we're not sharing it. Particularly, we're using it in terms of sort of assessing where a client is. So asking a client what they know about the labour market and then kind of matching it to our own understandings can help us to identify what a client might need, where their misunderstandings or where they might value some additional information, where those areas might be. So we might use information quite indirectly to support our clients. We might use it indirectly in terms of just being aware of kind of contemporary labour market issues. Another big theme in the literature, and there's quite a lot being done in terms of sort of guidance around this area. So handling and using information requires a level of skill and competence on behalf of career practitioners and consideration of ethical issues. So some work calls it higher level skill. It's something that isn't actually that straightforward, because you are having to take into account these different factors. And it doesn't necessarily just involve having information, but it's about understanding how to access information and how to help individuals access information, and about how to check the validity of information. So sort of skills using information, not just information itself. Moving on to just the final slide then, I thought it would be worth drawing this part of the session to a close by introducing or summarising this session through the key findings in the report. So there are 6 key findings in the report, and they're on this slide. And I'm just going to talk through them one by one. So the first one, which is what we talked about earlier on in this session, there's a need for a clear and inclusive view about what is meant by labour market information. So we need to be clear about what, how we are using the term, and when we use the term, we need to be clear about how we're using it, so that we limit the risk of misunderstanding. And generally, labour market information as it's used in career practice is much wider than it would be when it's used by sort of economic policy interests. Technology can improve access to labour market information, but can also create problems in terms of quality. So technology, particularly the internet, is creating lots of potential around labour market information, but the question of how to harness that potential and how to provide information which is of a good quality to individuals is a different sort of question. So there's a lot of work in that area. The LMI available to service users is not always sufficiently comprehensive. So that's particularly those kind of issues around sort of gaps in our data set, the gaps around educational and vacancy information, the gaps around local labour market information, and the gaps about transferability of skills. So although we exist in this sort of data-rich world, there's lots of information on the internet, and there's lots of data being produced in these national data sets, actually we still have some gaps, and recognising that is important. For the end user, the quality of labour market information is more important than quantity, particularly that evidence that we've just thought about, which says that actually the quantity of labour market information can be problematic. It can impede decisions. So using information a little and often, little bits of information, using it with a purpose, using it carefully is likely to be more valuable, and using sort of insights as well as sort of insights and inspiration as well as sort of information as it would traditionally be defined. Career professionals need to be appropriately skilled in the use and management of labour market information and keep their knowledge up to date. So it's a key skill for careers advisors, and it needs to be something that we are maintaining our skills in. And this final point, which is around the kind of theories and models, that the use of labour market information should be linked to insights derived from theories of decision-making theory. So particularly this kind of developing area around critical approaches, it shows that, you know, maintaining our kind of interest in theoretical approaches, models of guidance can help us to really engage with labour market information and ensure that we're using it in a kind of thoughtful way. I would normally finish with a slide with references, but I've just given you here the link to the report itself, because all the references are in that report, and I thought it might be something that people might want to have a look at. We're going to go on to some breakout rooms shortly, but before we do that, I wanted to see if anybody has any brief questions or points of clarification at this point. I'll just stop sharing. Okay. So I'm just giving it a minute or two in case anyone types a question in the chat. We're going to move into breakout sessions anyway, and I'll put the slides back on the screen so you can see what the breakout sessions we're asking you to do. So this is the focus for the breakout sessions. We're going to give you 20 minutes in groups, and I thought it would be useful. Like, I would just be really interested in your thoughts. I mean, it's a really interesting group of people here today. NICEC is always a kind of group of people who've got interesting ideas, and I thought, you know, it'd be nice for me to hear your thoughts about the presentation and your thoughts about some of the things that I've talked about. So any surprises, any questions, any comments, I thought it'd be useful just to have a chat in your breakout rooms about that. And then, I mean, I think one of the things that might be interesting for NICEC to think about too, and I'd be interested in your thoughts, very interested in your thoughts, is how we could use labour market information better in our work and what might help us to do this. So sort of what next? Where do we go next with labour market information as a profession, as a sector? And we're going to ask you to go into groups, but please nominate someone in each of your groups, because at the end of the breakout sessions, we'll ask one person from each group to give feedback on behalf of that group.
Welcome back, everybody. Hopefully that was a rich discussion following Rosie's input. We're hoping that each of the groups can report back briefly on the 2 questions that we posed for you, So room 1, Emma joined you very late, but there was Karina and Will. So hopefully there'll be somebody from the group able to share some of the discussions that you had on the areas for discussion.
Hi Claire, it's Mina.
Hi.
For some reason my videos decided to stop working, but never mind. Yeah, so we had a really good discussion, and I think to answer the first question, what do we think about the presentation? I don't think there was any surprises, but I think it was just a reminder about how complex LMI actually is, and the different sources. And in terms of the kind of second question, I think it was really about access to meaningful LMI. So I think there was one, you know, we kind of recognised that the career service in Scotland and in Wales has some really good LMI, but in England, you know, we just don't have that kind of level of detail, and we often refer to the one in Scotland and in Wales. And I guess in terms of, you know, how could we help and what help do we need? A couple of things really. First of all, we recognise that a lot of students and individuals actually get access to LMI, lots of detail, lots of data, and actually having somebody that can actually walk them through what all of that means for them. So either a career coach or a careers guidance, a careers guidance individual. The second thing is around training on LMI. You know, it's really there's a lot around it. We really need to kind of understand and start to pull that together in terms of messaging. And the last one is that LMI is not just about you know, facts and figures. It's also kind of pulling together kind of anecdotal evidence, opinions, views, and just making sure that's a kind of a holistic view of LMI sources.
Thanks for that. Wendy, am I handing over to you?
Yes. Any comments on that, Rosie, before we go to the next group? I wondered if the training was for the practitioner or the client in the feedback.
It was both, Wendy.
Both.
Yeah, because I think for practitioners, yeah, because there just seem to be so many more sources for where to get the LMI, and also from a practitioner, from an individual perspective, to kind of just figuring out how do you put all of that together.
Yeah, so LMI is part of careers education, really, as well as career
absolutely.
guidance. Rosie, any comment from you before we turn to the second group?
No, it was really interesting to hear those thoughts. I mean, I guess one of the things that kind of came to mind and that did come out of the research was the question of how we think about quality in information. So those kind of concepts of validity and those kinds of things. And I guess one of the challenges with lots of information being provided through social media and qualitative and anecdotal evidence is then how do we think about quality and how do we help people to determine the quality of information, because it becomes a little bit more challenging maybe than it just becomes a bit more challenging. So I think there was something really interesting there for me about quality, and there's some interesting work being done around social media and the importance of helping career practitioners think about how to use social media in their practice.
Interesting. I should say before we go to the next group, do all of you type in the chat anything you want to add, because Rosie and Claire are going to be scooping up the chat later and making some notes of what's happened today. So even if you haven't got a question per se, any comments and other rich reviews would be welcome. So let's turn to group 2 now, which I think had Lynn and Pete in amongst others.
Yeah, I can talk to this. We like the idea of linking LMI to theory. That's something we haven't normally done, so that was a very welcome suggestion. But LMI is difficult time consuming for practitioners, and so where help is provided from organisations, CDI or any source that supports career development practitioners to access it in a simple way is very welcome. We had an issue about lifespan development. Maybe people at different stages of life have different needs and interact with information differently. Older workers, for example, might have to transfer skills from one context to another and perhaps engage with the web-based sources in a different way to young people. Some interesting issues around higher education. So the Delhi destinations information can be useful and sometimes even nuanced to be linked to vocational specific courses, as well as making comparisons with school shortage areas. Also useful to have information around the skills employers are looking for in the graduate sector, or indeed conversely, the skills that perhaps school pupils gain from specific subjects at schools, being aware of the skills that geography gives you that you can take to the labour market. And also perhaps an issue around how at a policy level careers services are seen as a way of reconciling labour supply and demand, but it's quite difficult for us to push skill shortage areas onto our clients. It's maybe not what they're wanting to hear. Yeah, so I think there's a few of the points, not all, but a few of the points that we've mentioned.
Really interesting. I love that idea of giving employers information about potential employees. You hardly ever encounter that thought, that you know, employers need different sorts of labour market information too. Fascinating. Should we move on to group 3, Rosie? We keep moving. Group 3, I think, had Jill and Keith in amongst others. Thank you, Pete, so much. We've got someone from group 3.
Do you want me to?
Yeah, do.
Yeah. So, we kind of went round in a number of circles, but I think LMI is quite a big simplification of the world, and it's one which is probably we thought was probably more useful to people who are at a higher level. So particularly, like if you're a business or a government, then the kind of data that we typically get in LMI is probably good enough for you to make decisions based on. If you're an individual, it's probably mostly not good enough, or it's not very, very helpful. But I think we held on to the idea that there is a real world out there that it's very important when people are thinking about their careers for them to discover. And where we kind of were getting to at the end was really what the role of, well, either career guidance people or people in careers education, what the role is to help people to encounter a range of different sources, but also to help them to recognize that none of them give a simplistic answer, and that you have to be fairly tolerant of sort of ambiguity and risk and so on, and that what information and your curiosity about the world and the various sources of information that might be out there, both kind of government sources and other forms of sources, including, you know, looking with your own eyes at what's in your local area and so on. That all of those things, you have to try and sort of draw them in and treat them as good clues and good notions about which direction to go in, but not the answer. And the more you kind of give people the idea that there is an absolute answer, the more you're selling people a bit of a lie, really. So we sort of danced around some of those kinds of issues.
And there, it links that with a comment in the chat earlier, I think it was Jane, you know, of thinking about this as part of one's learning about how to use different sources and trust information or not much more widely. And is that a lens you've been thinking a lot about, Rosie? You know, it's part of that wider challenge we all have in a world that's got lots of information about, but much of it is either unreliable or not necessarily what we want.
Yeah, absolutely. And the kind of information literacy stuff, I think, is really important. So it's not just like who produced this information, it's actually what does this information say. So some of that stuff that came out from Pete's group around the nuanced data in higher education, I think, is interesting, because like the way we aggregate courses in higher education, or the way we aggregate jobs, you know, how we're doing that then has an impact on what data we're producing, and being able to understand that as practitioners is really quite important, and then being able to work with that with our clients. So yeah, I think that stuff around information literacy is very important, and it is about helping people to make sense of the world, and you have the skills to do that.
Let's hear from our fourth group, which I think had David and Anne and Bella in.
Hello there. Yes. So group 4, we were talking about the need for LMI, and understanding of LMI is always in the past. The information is always in the past. And David had an interesting viewpoint in his role around teaching careers leaders, and careers starting, you know, kind of careers information LMI starting very young. And recognizing that even with that information, by the time a pupil graduates, of course, that role that they've been told about when they were 13 or 14 could have changed dramatically by the time they finish the, you know, education and training, by the time they're in their, you know, late teens, early 20s. Other things that came up were around ethics, and particularly around social justice initiatives, which may impact on the ability of career professionals being able to give impartial information and advice in career settings. You know, from my own perspective as a CDP, I would prefer to abide by a code of ethics where I aim to be as impartial as I possibly can be. I firmly believe that's a, you know, a good thing to do. But what if I'm curtailed by a group who says, yes, we don't want to be promoting this particular group of industry here because of their record on whatever it is, the environment or human rights or whatever, which indeed is a very noble thing to think about. But then how does that censor what we're doing? So that came up, and you know, of course, quality of data, making sure that we are equipping people to evaluate that data effectively, and that's really about it, I think, from group 4, unless there's anything else from David and Anne.
That's fine.
Okay.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Really interesting. I think that point about potential no-go areas is absolutely fascinating. Rosie, do you have a view about, you know, gagging career advisors from talking about certain sorts of work? I hadn't even thought about that before today.
Well, I think it highlights that it's a difficult thing, like the ethics here about how we decide what information to share and how we share it is actually, you know, there's a decision-making process there. It's not neutral, and some authors who I came across would say that provision of information is rarely impartial because it's being provided with a purpose. So it's, you know, it's difficult to be impartial because you're always providing information with a purpose and selecting how you're presenting it. So yeah, I think it just highlights that actually this is something that requires thought, and ethics are important here.
Yes, Jill is asking if you can find LMI on sex work. Good question, Jill. I'm sure you can, certainly in Denmark or Holland. Don't know about the tight-lit Brits. Fascinating.
I mean, there's another thing there about informal work, different forms of work. Like, what information have we got? Because actually, the information that we tend to have is around certain forms of formal employment, and not necessarily. We don't necessarily have data around informal work.
There are one or two things I could pick up from the chat, but let's see if there are any other questions before we come back. Anybody else got something they're dying to ask that hasn't come up, or a suggestion?
I've just got one thing then, if I can. In lots of other stuff I've read about LMI or heard about LMI, people often make the distinction between labour market information and labour market intelligence. But is that just almost a red herring, really? I noticed you haven't made any reference to that at all, Rosie. You just got on with it and talked about LMI. Is it an important distinction, or is it just something that people just interest themselves in playing about with definitions?
I did mention it briefly, but so briefly it might have just gone past. I think one of the things that's interesting for me is how many different definitions we have, and like this kind of sense of labour market information, labour market intelligence, and then labour market information and careers and labour market information and core LMI, and there are lots of different hard and soft LMI. There are lots of different ways of thinking about LMI. And my position is we do offer a definition. We offer our own definition in this report. My position is one that would be, we just have to be clear about what we're talking about. Right. So when we're talking about labour market information, what's frustrating, and it's frustrating even doing this literature review, is when people talk about labour market information, but they don't define what it is. So it's difficult to tell, you know, is this statistical information? Is this information which is being produced? You know, what is it? Where is it from? And how are we defining this? So I think I did mention it only very briefly, but partly because I think that we risk proliferating definitions in this area, and just being clear about what we're talking about, I think from my perspective, is the important thing.
Yes, some comments in the chat about that too. I must say, during COVID, one of the things I've valued in a fast-moving labour market, which I would see as intelligence, are people who are taking trusted, usually large-scale data and really helping one understand what the trends mean. I think that's been enormously valuable. So they're not trying to forecast, but they're saying not just this is where we are right now, but this is how things have been moving. And this is why the figures look like that. So which groups are changing in here? Which jobs are, so it's got that fine grained nature that Rosie was talking about. So other people are digging into it and helping you understand it. But I don't know if other people would see that as labour market intelligence in the way that I'd. So trusted commentators is kind of a category I would suggest, who aren't trying to make a point necessarily, but they're digging lower in the data than I would have the time to help me understand why the figures are moving a certain way. Can we recommend any? You mean any sources, Bella?
You recommended trusted pundits.
The two I've used a lot, but I am biased. You know, we all have to recognise our own bias. Is I think the work that Tony Wilson has been doing at IES to comment on the labour market. He's been informing the government and indeed the Office of National Statistics. He's been informing them. And I also think the Learning and Work Institute's done some very good work too. I'm on mailing lists for those, and I just think that in 2 minutes they give me a quick feel for what's happening, and I know they're not just making it up. But I'm sure other people here have other Tony Thingamy at IES, yes, Wilson, indeed. Thanks,
That's fantastic. Thank you.
He's very good, but he's not the only one. You know, I think there are, and indeed ONS's increased capability to comment on their data as well as provide it. Now, admittedly, that's only certain categories of data. It doesn't cover Rosie's huge canvas. But you know, we all have different needs too. But other people, where do you go?
Tristan coming in on that.
Well, I was going to make a different point, but yeah, I mean, CIPD. I mean, John Boyes, who many of us know, is now the economist for CIPD. I'll put his link to his Twitter up, and he posts lots of stuff. He's been doing lots of stuff on home working and so on, and how much is it going on. So he's a good sort of person who likes to sit and crunch through the data. But I suppose I do question a bit whether what Wendy is saying is really what we're talking about, in that you are a labour market expert, you care about what's happening in the labour market. But, you know, I mean, I'll just give you an example that we were talking about briefly at the NICEC meeting today. We were saying, or Charlie was talking about how people over the age of 55 are leaving the labour market in quite high numbers at the moment. Well, that's really interesting for us, isn't it? In terms of understanding the pattern of how the labour market's going. But that doesn't mean that because you're over 55, you've got to leave the labour market. And it doesn't necessarily mean there are more or less opportunities for you there, really. So I think this is where there's an important distinction to make between what is it useful for us to know at the level of policy, of understanding, of noticing trends and so on, and what is it actually useful for an individual to know when they're making a career decision. And more and more, I think that they're two quite separate categories, really.
Yes, I would agree, Tristram, and I think, as indeed Rosie said, you know, that individuals, their needs are so contextual. Do you want to help us finish up on that one, Rosie, about how you'd summarise what you think individuals really could do with a bit more of? Because I think there is that difference, isn't there, between the practitioner need as well as just the interested person need and the individual need.
Yeah, I mean, I might take it full circle and take it back to that experience I had as a trainee, because what Tristram's describing is exactly that dilemma. Like, if we know that there's a skill shortage in this area in 10 years or right now, but how does that translate to this particular individual with these interests, which might not be in that area? And how do I use this kind of statistical data with an individual? And I think one of the things for me, and also, I made a note about what came out of Pete's group, that kind of sense that LMI is difficult and time consuming for practitioners. And I think if I could go back and talk to my 2000 self, I would say LMI is bigger than you think it is. You don't need to be telling people information all the time. And you can encourage your clients to access lots of different sources, and the qualitative insights that you might get from friends and family and people you know are really valid, maybe in a different way, but you know, that kind of qualitative information is really, really valuable. And so I think Tristram's point is a really good one, and it brings me right back to that point. Before we finish, can I just say thank you so much to everybody for this discussion. It's fascinating, and I wish we had a bit longer, because I'd love to continue to discuss this.
Thank you, Rosie. It's been amazing, and I love ending on your 20-year-old self. I think that's such a good. It's such a useful thing to reflect on. So thanks from me too, but can I pass back to Claire, who I think just wanted to notice another upcoming.
Put in the chat that the discussion can continue at the Cutting Edge event on the 25th of April. That's a NICEC CDI event. So I've put the link to the booking on that, and many thanks to Rosie for the input, and to Wendy for steering the discussions. So thanks very much for that. And I should say that we'll capture, won't we, Rosie, the richness of the discussion from the groups, and that will be available along with the recording that Michael's collected from today. So hopefully that will be useful for people going forward. Many thanks. More or less on time.
Well done. Thanks for everyone. Gotta go.
Thanks
Bye.
a lot. Cheerio.
Thank you,
Jill.
everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Very good. Cheers.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thanks, Bella. Thank you.